So, we've understood how culture functions. Going back to the narrative of Mr. Watson, he defines some cultures as bad because people in these cultures eat tigers' penises. He gives another example of India as having a bad culture because people have a habit to defecate in public. Can we judge India's whole culture based on this act? What about the other cultural productions? I mean their clothes, drama, music, sciences and so on and so forth. Let me ask you a question. Who are we to judge and condemn their culture in the first place? If we follow Mr. Watson's logic and start measuring cultures and assigning adjectives to them, then someone would argue that the West has a bad culture because it was based on racism and imperialism, which is far worse than just people defecating in public in my opinion. Racism or racial profiling is judging you and even discriminating and abusing you physically because of the color of your skin. And it gets worse when it's institutionalized and authorized under the premise of the white man is the best or the white privilege. These sort of statements remind me of the survival of the fittest that is deprived from its biological context and used in cultural context to justify racism. Imperialism is a fact. It is that cultural mindset that pushes one cultural group to narcissistically glorifies itself and step on the other cultural group simply because it is represented as inferior. In fact, post-colonial studies shed light on the complex discourse of cultural imperialism and how the West was successful to evolve and flourish on the expanse of degrading, exploiting, abusing and distorting other cultures. The Western civilization was motivated by racism and economic interests to colonize other countries and used false claims such as saving and rescuing other cultures from themselves only to invade them and exploit their wealth and distort their culture. Take the example of how the British colonial forces created a famine in India in 1870 by exclusively exporting a huge amount of food to Britain, which resulted in 29 million deaths among Indian population because of starvation. Kenya also suffered from colonial exploitation where the Kikuyu people were systematically tortured to death using extreme tools such as brutally smashing their testicles. These cases are elaborated in George Monbiot's video entitled "The Dark Side of British History You Weren't Taught in School." You can watch it later to learn more about that. But generally speaking, the West was once the most brutal imperialistic military power on earth, motivated by the passion of abusing the other, or the so-called inferior cultures, exploiting their lands, labor, and even dehumanizing their population because they were not qualified enough to be considered as complete human beings. The West empowered itself by the wealth of colonized countries under the premise of civilizing the uncivilized or cultivating the uncultivated. I know that since the dawn of postmodernism, the West is doing its best to overcome and counterattack any discourses of racism, but such structural hegemonic view of culture is responsible of developing extreme ideologies and propagandas that divide people and create terrorist mindsets such as those of ISIS and Nazism. If a Western man thinks that other people and their culture are inferior, it is because the West is the responsible of their inferiority. Go read the Western history. Other cultures' backwardness may be the result of the West exploitation and interference. Colonial powers deprived them from their lands and wealth, negatively affected their identity and perception of the self. For example, let's consider the discourse of Orientalism. Orientalism, the book, is produced by Edward Said. He sheds light on the factual historical hegemonic representations created by the West to depict the Orient as a savage community that needs to be civilized. If you Google that, you will encounter massive amount of literature and paintings made by Western intellects and artists that portray the Arab as an exotic culture filled by savagery and eroticism. I don't mean that the Arab world was a paradise, but taking one extreme aspect of a culture and generalizing, homogenizing and perpetuating it, the same imaginary, the same discourse, again and again and again, It is called institutionalized systematic racism. The discourse of Orientalism is still fostered in modern days. Details on that matter are elaborated by the pen of Jack Shaheen in his book Rare Bad Arabs, and how Hollywood vilifies and represents them in stereotypical ways. They are usually morons, buffoons, stinky, clowns, sexiest, awkward people with freaky eyebrows, you name it. Black people are also still experiencing real struggles because of the complex of inferiority caused to them by systematic slavery executed by the whites. Again, I am not into any sort of political correctness, but I'm just stating facts. Althusa argues that black people are always already in the historicity of the culture. Go and read Franz Fanon's book Black Skin, White Masks, and how the black man, from a psychoanalysis perspective, has a third-person consciousness where he discovers himself through the eye of the Western white man as a cannibalistic, intellectually deficient, ugly, and primitive. If you want to throw adjectives on cultures and call them bad or deficient, we need first to recall the cause of the deficiency. Let us revisit the illegal imperial occupation of Iraq and how the ideology of democratizing the Arab world opened the door for the US to exploit Iraq's oil and wealth. Iraq's libraries and museums were looted and distracted instead of being safeguarded and preserved as property of humanity. How would we learn about other cultures when their cultural productions are erased and distorted because of imperialistic interference? Another vivid example that shows how imperialistic supremacist cultures aim to distort and handicap other cultures and finally calling them low and bad is an example of linguistic manifestations in ex-colonized countries. Take the example of Morocco and Algeria and how the French colonial powers were able to cause identity crisis by successfully creating class distinction thanks to language as a powerful tool of societal segregation. Indigenous people who do not have the chance to master French language are usually deprived to access some administrative information. Society is doing its best to imitate the white French in his language as a role model. People are striving to distinguish their profiles, level of education, and social status by using French language. Those who do not understand French are marginalized and even seen as uneducated. Some social classes are totally adopting the French model of living to the extent of feeling ashamed to be associated with their indigenous culture. Belittling one's own culture is not spontaneous as it may seem. Mr. Watson also argues that the West offers minorities a tolerable place of living. I argue that thanks to the direct or indirect imperialistic invasion and interference to these minorities' homeland and wealth, they were obliged to leave their places and seek better conditions. Yet still they offer cheap labor as a form of modern slavery. It is shameful to deny the unjustified military interference of cultural imperialistic mindset and how it generated terror, insecurities, separation, poverty, misery, and retardation. So-called third world cultures are losing their features and routines. If we really think that the West ended up slavery, remember that thanks to extreme capitalistic ideologies in a framework of globalization empowered by the greed of multinational corporations, the West has actually contributed in the creation of another form of slavery manifested in labor. We have poor wages, long working hours, and black markets. Nowadays, people are buying into extreme capitalistic values on the expense of their own values, morals, and culture. The slavery is still going on and on. Humanity has exchanged its sanity in essence with papers. This ends only when we believe in humanity, equality, equity, and justice. To conclude this video, my general point is that all the discourses that use cultural dichotomy of low versus high or my culture is better than yours give us nothing but hate and extreme practices. Everything is interconnected thanks to the advent of technology, the internet, and free market. Any attempt to spread one ideology and force people to abide by one lifestyle is heavily political and less cultural. Egoism and narcissism give an illusive sense of superiority, accompanied by laziness and passivity. Extreme behaviors coming from migrants and minorities need to be fixed using mindful migration strategies and justice. We need to invent discourses that spread awareness and reparation, and be active instead of hating the different other because of the skin or cultural practices. Some of the first world economics are exclusively based on the efforts of those minorities. We need to learn from history. Progress is not achieved by adopting ethnocentric views. Progress is achieved by collaboration and justice. So there you go. We have reached the end of this episode. I have a few questions for you. Can you tell me, how do you interpret culture? Do you believe that some cultures are better than others? And why? Is the backwardness of some cultures the result of other cultures' interference and abuse? Or there are other reasons for that? Let's educate each other by expressing your comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to Intellectual Overdose for new content. You can also follow my Facebook page. If you're into music or humorous retro gaming reviews, try to check the links of my other pages and channels in the description. I would like to express my salutation, appreciation to my professors in the English department of Moulay Ismail faculty of Meknes. Goodbye for now. Have an immersive intellectual journey. See you next time.